Today I'm going to share with you the settings I use when I go out shooting with my Olympus camera. Okay, so straight out of the box, the Olympus cameras, they really take great pictures. And I guess you wouldn't even need to change anything if that's all you want to do is go out and take a few shots. But honestly, if you don't change a lot of the settings, you're only tapping really, I think, 10% of the potential that these cameras are capable of. So I thought it'd be useful or helpful if I shared with you how I set up my camera. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the settings I use are correct. It's just how I set up the camera for when I go shooting. So as I go through the menu items, I want you to think about maybe how you might do things differently when you go out shooting. Okay, because I'm going to set up the camera primarily for like when I just go out shooting, when I go out for a walk in the park, taking pictures of flowers and trees, maybe a stream. Pictures of my dog, etc. These settings generally work pretty well. So street shooting, in other words. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be using the E-M10 Mark II as an example, but the menu system is very similar across Olympus cameras, including the Pen F, the E-M1, the E-M5, even some of the TG Tough cameras. I saw the menus on those and I was like, wow, they're very similar. So let's go ahead and I'll use this as the base camera, but there may be some subtle differences that I'll point out between this and the Pen F, because these are the two cameras that I own. And my E-M1 Mark II I only use really for videos, so I rarely set that up for any kind of shooting other than for video. So first thing I do is I like to set the camera into aperture priority. Okay, that's generally how I shoot, so I can control the lens aperture and the depth of field. And let's go ahead into the menus now. And let me show you this. I'm going to just do a full factory reset real quick so we're all on the same page. So the first menu item, of course, is the card setup. So you can format or do all erase. I prefer to format, so I always have a clean slate on the card. Sometimes when you just do all erase, sometimes the card has other stuff on it that won't get erased. Maybe you had it in a different brand camera, or maybe you're using it for your music, whatever. But so I always like to do format so I get the maximum number of pictures. Okay, and then you'll notice that here the pop-up menu tells you what that line item is for. And when you first get the camera, this is kind of handy to kind of tell you what each line item is doing. Sometimes they're really vague, but sometimes they're very good descriptions. But I like to turn this off because I already kind of know what's going on with everything here. Then the next item is the Reset My Set, and we'll come back to this last. Like I said, I've already done a full factory reset from this menu, but I'm also going to be using the My Set menu item. Okay, and I do have another video on the My Sets and function buttons that you should check out if you want to see a lot more detail on how that works. But for this video, we're just going to come to an end and quickly set it. Okay, picture mode. Now picture mode is set default to natural, and these profiles: enhance, vivid, natural, portrait, muted, monotone, custom. Then there's a bunch of art filters after that. These are only for your JPEG files. So if you're a JPEG shooter, you should go out and practice taking different pictures with all these different modes and see which ones you like, and then you can go from there. But for me, I generally shoot JPEG plus RAW and then only process the RAW files. Occasionally I'll just use the JPEG file if it's just I want it quick and dirty, give it to somebody or put it online. But if I'm halfway serious about the picture, then I'm going to be processing in RAW. So I just leave this to natural because I can do everything else through the Olympus, I think it's called viewer software, which is fine. Okay, so the next item here is the camera resolution icon, and I like to just call it a pixel icon. But you'll notice that the still picture default is set to large normal, and that's not the best setting for JPEG. You really want to set this to large fine. And there's another setting, and I'll come back to that when we get to it in the menu, is called super fine. Now for me, I always like to shoot large fine plus raw. Okay, and then before we're done, this is going to change to large super fine plus raw, which is the highest JPEG quality setting this camera was capable of. Okay, and then for movie mode, full HD, 1080p, 60p. This works for me because then I can do slow motion if I want to do a little later, but the default setting's fine. Image aspect. Okay, image aspect 4:3, hence the name Micro Four Thirds System. it tells you basically that this is a 4:3 aspect ratio, but you can change that to be 16:9 or 1:1, which is a common Instagram format. But this is only changes the JPEG file. It doesn't touch the RAW file. So you'll notice that's why there's so many lines here. There's a line for RAW, line for large, line for medium, then small. And if I change this, you'll notice I changed the 16:9. It did not change the dimensions of the RAW file. The RAW file is always going to capture the full 4:3 image sensor. But it will change the JPEG file to be 4608 by 2592. So if I set it to this, and we go back to live view, you'll notice the word Olympus here has been cut off. So that's why I like to shoot in 4:3, because I primarily shoot in RAW, and now you'll see that the word Olympus is, in full view now, including the prism and everything. So that way I can always crop and post, and I know what I've captured. If I do have a certain thing in mind, and if it's going to help me to compose the photo a little better, I may change the aspect ratio, but for default 4:3 is what I prefer to shoot in. Okay, the next item is the digital teleconverter, and this is very similar to the aspect ratio. The only difference is that instead of cropping 16:9, it's going to crop 100% to a 2x zoom equivalent. So if you're shooting 25mm, it'll shoot as if the lens were a 50mm, and so on. But again, this only affects the JPEG file. If you take a picture with a digital teleconverter, you're going to crop in 2x zoom picture of your subject, but then you're also going to have the RAW file, okay, if you shoot in large fine plus RAW, JPEG plus RAW format. So you're going to get two files, one JPEG and one RAW file, but the RAW file is going to be the full wide image, whereas the JPEG is going to be the cropped in 2x zoom image. So I just prefer to leave that off again, so I know exactly what I'm capturing in RAW. Okay, the next item is the shutter modes. Now for me, I prefer to shoot in anti-shock. So the idea being that this is effectively the electronic first curtain shutter, and it eliminates one of the shutter movements, thereby reducing the internal shake or vibrations that the camera generates on its own. So I prefer to shoot in anti-shock. I prefer that over silent mode. One, because I still get the beep confirmation for focus, but also because I like to shoot with off-camera flash. And to do that, I need to be in a mechanical shutter mode of some kind. So I'll pop up the flash as a trigger for this flash, so I can do off-camera flash. I can't do that if I'm shooting in silent shutter mode. Okay, so that's what I do there. And then for time-lapse, if you're going to go out and do time-lapse photo, you need to be very deliberate and very specific about all the settings. So you're going to probably be changing a lot of other settings that would not be common to just doing general street shooting. So I just leave this off. If I'm going to do time-lapse, I'll probably save all of those settings into a different time my set. Okay, now, finally, shooting menu number 2. Nothing here really that I need to change, because these are bracketing modes, HDR, keystone. These are all very kind of specialty things that you would do in a very deliberate way, and all the other settings in the camera might have to be changed anyway. So I just leave these off. The only thing you might notice here actually is this anti-shock silent is here again. In my opinion, it should have been in the previous menu with the shutter modes, but basically what this is basically it's delaying the amount of time between when the shutter opens and when the shutter takes the exposure, or when the shutter closes and when it takes the exposure, depending what shooting mode you're in. So thereby again reducing potential shutter shock or vibration internal to the camera that might mess up your picture. And this can be handy in astrophotography possibly, but to me it's a little bit overkill in my opinion. I've never used it, but that's something is available to you if you do have a need for it, because again, photography is really about problem solving, and if you're having problem with camera shake, this might solve it. So there it is. Okay, so I'm glad it's there, but I never use it. Okay, the next thing here is the play menu. This is something also that I don't use at all really. Occasionally I'll use this connection to smartphone item here, but this is if you want to play back and look at the pictures in the camera. But me personally, the only time I look at the pictures on the camera is after I take the picture, And then I offload everything and look at everything on the computer. I don't need to look at them through the camera itself. However, the defaults here are fine, but the connection to smartphone, basically all that does is turns your cell phone into the live view, and then you can control the camera and take pictures with your cell phone. And I'll do a separate video on that, you know, maybe at another time. But I don't generally use it, but it's handy if you want to place the camera, say, somewhere closer to some subject or wildlife, and you want to go hide in the bushes with your phone and take pictures. You know, that's maybe one use for it. Okay. Okay, let's go into the custom menu. The first line item here is the autofocus manual focus, and we'll go into autofocus modes. And I don't change anything here. Single point autofocus for taking pictures, continuous autofocus for movie. That works just fine for me. But again, you can change that as you please here. And I'll do a video on all the different focusing modes at another time. Okay, full-time autofocus. Basically, that's telling the camera to continuously try to acquire focus even when you're not using it. You're not pushing any buttons, you're not composing, what have you. So basically it just drains the battery. You know, I only like the camera to try to focus or acquire focus when I'm looking at it and deliberately trying to take a picture. But there may be some use for it, but it's not something I can use or have found a use for me personally. So I leave this off. The next mode is the AEL AFL. Okay, now this I did a video on back button focus and AEL AFL functions, and I go into a lot more detail there. But for this video, basically in single point autofocus, I'm going to leave it in mode 1. It works fine for me. I half press the shutter, it locks focus, locks exposure, fully pressing takes the picture. And then this button here is default AEL, but everything default there is fine. Reset lens on. I like to turn this off. And this is handy particularly with zoom lenses. And what this does is, you know, let's say I'm taking a picture of this camera here, and I'm composing the shot with the zoom. Let's say I want a 25mm focal length, and I want to focus on the name here, OM2S. Okay, and then I'm doing product photography, for example, and I want to set up my flash. And while I'm doing this, the camera goes to sleep. So what this does is and then I wake the camera up, and what will happen is the lens will be reset back to 14mm and not focused on anything. So by turning the reset lens off, if the camera happens to go to sleep while you're doing other stuff, when you wake it back up, it'll be right back to where you left it to. So this is useful more with the power zoom type lenses. If you're using a fixed prime lens, it doesn't really matter, but it doesn't hurt to leave it off. Okay, now let's go back into the menu. Bulb time focusing. Basically that means you can try to focus while it's taking the bulb exposure. I just leave that on. I don't use it that much. Focus ring direction, I just leave that to default. And then manual focus assist, I leave both of these off, which is the magnify and peaking, even though I use both of them, but I reprogram my function buttons to do these particular features rather than having the camera automatically turn them on when I'm manually focusing, because I would prefer to have control of when those things are active or not. So I leave them off. Okay, then the next menu item is the set home, which is the focusing point, default focusing point you want to have. And for me, I prefer it to be the center focusing point. And you can change it if you go into the menu, but center is fine, center. And now you'll notice the icon changed here to just a little dot, which means it's now set to single point autofocus and actually be a single point. Okay, it's not going to search all over the frame to try to find a focus point. Okay, autofocus illumination, I like to turn this off. And that's mainly because a lot of times the lens I'm using, if it's trying to focus in the dark, it'll turn this little LED on to try to, illuminate the subject to try to acquire focus a little better. But a lot of times the lens I'm using is blocking that LED anyway. Even this little kit lens with this tiny hood on it, the LED does not cover the subject. So I just turn it off. It just wastes battery. Okay, face priority. I also turned this off. Because generally when I'm street shooting, I'm not taking pictures of people. I'm taking pictures of flowers and trees and streams, etc. So I just leave this off. I don't like potentially the focus point working any harder than it has to. Okay, AF pointer on. I like that to be on so I see the focus point through the viewfinder and live view. And the targeting pad I'd like to leave off. I think that's when you have your thumb on the back and you can change the focus points. You know, I never shoot that way, and sometimes my nose used to move the focus point, so you know, when I had the camera up to my face, so I you know, supposedly the firmware fixed a lot of that, but I just got used to shooting without it. Okay, now the button dial menu. Like I said earlier, I like to program the magnify and the peaking function, the function 1 and 2, so I can do that here in this menu. So I'm going to change the default back button from AEL to magnify. I'm going to change function 2, this button here, instead of multifunction, I'm going to change that to peaking. There it is. Okay, and then function 3, I'm going to change this to custom white balance, or one-touch white balance. Okay, so now if I push function 1, it'll magnify so I can sort of verify nailed focus, particularly if I'm using, you know, manual focus lens. And then this button will be the peaking, so I can magnify and peak at the same time to verify I have focus. And this is more useful when you're using adapted lenses. Okay, and then this function 3, I programmed the white balance so that if I do want to change the white balance and get it more accurate in camera before I go take it out in post and try and adjust the white balance, and I like to see what the picture is going to look like before I go into post, you know, while I'm out in the field, because sometimes I can never get it the way I want once I get back into post, regardless if I shot RAW or JPEG. And just a little tip, you know, the custom white balance is basically you know, the camera take a picture of a white piece of paper. So I keep a little folded white piece of paper in my camera bag, and when you buy paper, you should try to buy the 98% brightness. I think that's the brightest you can get. If there's higher, you know, get that one, but I found 98 inkjet, color inkjet paper, because there's other brightnesses like 92 brightness, and you'll notice when you put them side by side, there's a significant difference in color. So try to get the brightest paper you can. And then if you want to get really carried away, you can spend $100 and get one of these X-Rite color cards that has sort of a neutral white or gray here. This, in theory, will give you the most accurate color, but between the two, honestly, you get about 98% there. You know, no pun intended. But that's that. Now, I really should do a video on white balance because that's really been my nemesis in photography is getting white balance right, and I'm sure a lot of people have a problem with it, and everyone always says, yeah, you can fix that in post, but yeah, not really sometimes. So okay, so that's that. Let's see what else we got here. Okay, dial function. Now, like I said, I shoot in aperture priority, so I like to change the front button to be the aperture, or F number is what they call it, and then the back button, I like to make that the exposure compensation. And the reason I do that is because now it matches what I do on the Pen F, because the Pen F has a dedicated exposure comp button on the back, and then I use the front button as my F number or aperture dial. So that's why I change it there. Dial direction, I don't care, it's fine. Mode dial function. Now, here I'm going to program my set 1 to be eye auto. So let me show you what that is. If I do that, now anytime I turn this mode dial to the eye auto setting, it's going to change all of the settings in the camera to whatever I saved in my set 1. So just remember that, because we'll come back to that later. But for this menu item, that's what it's going to be. Okay, let's go to the next one, shutter release. Release priority single is what that stands for, and I like to leave this off, because if I turn it on, if I hit the info button, it'll tell you. If on is selected, the shutter can be released even when the camera is not in focus. Okay, I don't want to take a blurry picture, so I only want the camera to take a picture when it has acquired focus. And leaving this off will have the camera behave that way. Now for, sorry, let me turn the info off. For continuous autofocus, I like to leave it on, because usually what I'm doing is I am focusing, pre-focusing on a point, you know, say out in the middle of a field, anticipating that something's going to run across. So I've already focused on a point. So I want, and then once the subject starts to come, say it's a deer running, I'll fire off the shutter a little bit before it hits that focus point that I set, and then continue taking pictures until after it's past that focus point. And I don't want the camera to not take the picture because it doesn't think it has focus. So that's why I leave the continuous focus off. And they call that, I guess, maybe focus trapping. It's sort of a manual way of doing it. Some cameras do that automated way, but it's really handy in sports photography where you pre-focus on a point, then anticipate the action and start taking pictures before it happens. Okay, so that's all that is. Okay, and then the next few items are just the how many frames per second the different shooting modes will be. All of these are set to the highest possible, which is fine with me. I don't need to change this. Image stabilization I like to set in automatic. You can change it to be horizontal only, vertical, so that if you're doing panning shots or vertical panning, the image stabilization is not going to work against you, and in theory you should get a sharper picture. It's not something I use, but you know, if you do a lot of panning shots, you may want to give those a shot. Give that a try. Okay, image stabilization off. This is not on off for the complete image stabilization system. It's only when, as it says here, in continuous shooting. So again, that's so that the camera can do less work trying to stabilize the camera and focus on just firing the shutter. So leaving this off is fine for me. You know, but you can turn it on if you have really shaky hands and you're doing continuous shooting, and give that a shot. It may take less frames, but at least they'll be sharp when you get them, right? Okay, halfway we press release. All of this stuff I don't care. Lens priority. So if your lens has image stabilization built in, you can tell the camera to use that instead of the internal 5-axis. Release lag time, normal or short. Honestly, I have no idea what this is used for. So if anyone can tell me in the comments below why I would want to use this, let me know. I mean, intuitively it seems like, yeah, it's going to fire faster after you push the shutter. But it's nothing I can measure. I don't have any instruments, you know, to measure something like that. So, but that's there, so I just leave it to normal. Okay. Then the next thing is the display, sound, and PC. And HDMI out, you know, you can ask it to do 1080p or whatever. This is useful, I guess, if you have an external monitor set up, or if you want to play back your images on a television. You know, I don't use any of this stuff, but I do use the control settings and info settings and display grid. So let me go into those. Okay, so in control settings, I don't use iAuto, so I'm going to skip that. But in PASM, I do like to use the Super Control Panel. And Live Super Control Panel means just in live view Super Control Panel. So let me show you what that is. That's basically when you click the OK button in live view, this is your Super Control Panel. Okay, if you change this to Live Control, for example, and I click the OK, now you have a different menu structure. It's all the same things, they're just along the side instead of, you know, covering the live view or covering the subject. So whichever way you prefer, I just prefer the live view, and you can set it up to do both if you want, and then toggling would be done with the info button, but I leave just one, Live Super Control Panel. Okay, in art and scene, I don't care. I don't use those. Okay, now info settings. Basically, this is the information that the camera will tell you when you're in different modes. So when I'm in playback mode, what info do I want to see? Actually, all I want to see is the image by itself, so I can see everything in the frame clearly, and then the overall, which will tell me the shutter speed, aperture, ISO, etc. The histogram, ISO, or highlight, shadow, lightbox, all that stuff I can do in post-processing. I don't need to see it on the back of the camera. Mainly because I do shoot in RAW, and all of these other items here, histogram, highlight, shadow, are going to be reflective of the JPEG image in the camera, or the embedded JPEG in the RAW, not the actual RAW file. So I prefer to use those or look at those things when I'm in post. Okay, now when I'm in live view, what do I like to see? I don't need to see the image only, but I do like to see highlight, shadow, level gauge, and then custom 2 are the same thing, so I just turn this off. Okay, so what is that? Basically now when I click the info button, I'm seeing highlight, shadow, I'm seeing the level gauge, I'm seeing the histogram. I click it again, I'm going back to the default information, and that's all I need to see. And then this are basically the settings when you're playing back or looking at your pictures. Now, me personally, I like to set this to 9, and I turn off my clips and my calendar, and I'm done. Okay, so now when I go to play back, I can zoom out, and now I'm in a 9 grid display when I'm scrolling through the pictures. You can change this to, say, 100, so that if I zoom out, now it'll show 100 pictures, 10 by 10. For my eyes, that's just too small. I can't see anything like that. So I set this to 9 and turn that off. Okay, now display grid. This is actually the grid on the live view or in the viewfinder. So I do like to display the grid. There's a 9 grid pattern where it's 2 lines down the center, 2 lines across, and this is useful for, say, framing and rule of thirds type photography. Me personally, I like to use as many lines as I can because they're not very intrusive actually when I'm filming or taking pictures. And that way I have lines at the top, lines at the bottom, and out to the left and right as far as possible, so to help me level whatever image I'm taking. It's also useful when you're doing panel shots and you need more lines to kind of line up when you're taking one shot to the next. But think about if you want grid lines at all, or if you want to use a different grid line pattern, but that's what that is. Okay, then picture mode settings. Here it is again, but this time you get to pick which ones you can see. So again, from the Super Control panel, these are your picture modes, right? So there's Eye Enhance. But let's say I don't want Eye Enhance on the menu. I never use it. I don't want Vivid or Muted or Portrait, but I like monotone. Okay, so now when I go into the Super Control panel, you'll notice when I click over, it goes from natural to art. So it skipped the Vivid and Eye Enhance and the other things that I didn't check off. So that's all that is. Since I generally shoot RAW anyway, I just leave everything on. Because I never change it from natural anyway. But if I do want to play with the other settings, they're all there. Okay, histogram settings. Now, I did a video on how to tweak your histogram for better exposure, so check that out. But I changed this to 245, and I bumped this to 10. So all that does is basically tells the camera to start clipping highlights and shadows. Instead of at 255, it's going to clip the highlights at 245, and instead of clipping shadows at 0, it's going to be clipping the shadows at 10. So check out the other video that goes into more detail about that, but that's the default settings I use when I go out shooting. Okay, so the next thing is, are the exposure settings that you can use. And you can change the steps of the EV, so it moves in full steps or half steps or third steps. I just leave all of these default. Like noise reduction auto. Noise reduction and noise filter, they're very different noise reduction techniques. Noise reduction, the first one, noise reduction set to auto. Basically what that is for long exposures. So if your exposure is 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, what it'll do is it'll take you, say, your 20-second exposure, and then it'll take another exposure, but this time with the shutter completely closed, so it takes a completely black picture. And then what the camera does is looks at the noise that that black picture has in it and subtracts that from the original exposure you took. And this is very handy in astrophotography, for example, where a little speck of noise might look like a star in astrophotography. But generally speaking, you get cleaner pictures when you use this technique. And I leave that to auto. Okay. The noise filter, this is the filter that the camera processes your raw image and creates a JPEG. And, you know, standard, from what I've read, is, you know, smudges the details a little bit, also messes with the color a little bit. So I don't like to use standard. I'll just set this to low. And you can set it to high, but I set this to low because I want to get a head start on the noise reduction before I go into post if I'm going to be using a JPEG. It also helps me compare the camera's noise reduction processing versus what I can do on a raw file. So I set this to low so it does the minimal amount, but some just to get a head start. You can turn this completely off if you want to do all of the noise processing yourself, but for me, low works out for me. Okay. ISO, I leave this on auto. Okay. Let's see. ISO step and 1/3 steps, that's fine. It gives me a little more granularity. I don't have to, you know, change ISO in full stops. I can do it in thirds. Okay, auto set. I do change this. I change this to 6400. And you can change this all the way up to, I think, 25,000. But whatever you're comfortable with in terms of image quality, because when you raise the ISO, obviously you start losing image quality, whether it's grain, loss of color, dynamic range, etc. Up to 6400 works for me because I'd rather have a sharp picture than a blurry picture because the shutter speed's too low because the ISO is too low. So I do have a video on auto ISO and how it works. So if you're curious about that, you can check that out. Okay. And then ISO auto, I can change this to all. So it's going to work in P, A, S, and M. So it'll work in all modes. Okay, why not, right? Okay, metering. I'm fine with matrix metering, okay? But you can change it to centered weight metering. And the metering is basically how it's going to measure light. And if you have it in matrix metering, the camera sort of tries to figure out what the highlights are, the shadows are, and tries to find a balance between the two to get the subject or whatever's in the middle of the picture accurately exposed. Or not in the middle of the picture, but the picture in general correctly exposed. And it gets it right most of the time, so I'm fine with that. But like I said, I always chimp or double check the picture after I take it. And if there is a problem, I can do some exposure compensation. But if you're very deliberate and you like to shoot, a lot of people like to shoot in spot autofocus so that whatever their subject is under that spot is going to be exposed properly. But that's your prerogative. I just shoot in matrix. Okay, AL metering doesn't matter. It's set to auto. Bulb timer, these things really need a separate video. Same thing with flash sync. I leave it at 1/250th of a second. So I have the maximum shutter speed possible when I'm doing off-camera flash. And 160 is fine. There's reasons for changing that, which I'll talk about at another time, but 160 is for now is fine. And then exposure compensation on the flash I don't need because I'm using this flash primarily for triggering my off-camera flash, not for the exposure of the picture in front of it. Okay, and then we have again here pixel, color, and white balance. Okay, so we can set this, and this is where we can change the JPEG quality from normal fine to super fine. So let's go ahead and do that, and you do that right here. So now menu item number 1 is set to large superfine, and that's the only one I need to change. You can change the other ones to whatever you want, but that's what I do. So if you remember back at the beginning in shooting menu number 1, remember I set that to large, fine plus raw, but if we look at it now, you can see I have large, superfine plus raw available to me, and that will be my default setting. Okay, so let's go back. Let's go back into here. Okay, now pixel count. Basically, you're setting the size of the medium and small JPEGs. I don't use that. I ignore it. Shading compensation I turn on, and I think that's just for the native Olympus lenses that go with the camera. That if it does have any kind of vignetting or shading in the corners, it will automatically adjust for that for the JPEG files. Okay, it may do it in the RAWs as well. I'm not sure, but okay. I just turn it on. Doesn't hurt. Okay, white balance I leave to auto, because if I do want to change the white balance, I program the function 3 for custom white balance, where I'll, whip out this piece of paper to try to get the correct white balance. But otherwise, I just leave it in auto. And if you want to tweak the white balance for all your pictures, you can do that in this menu, but I just leave that to default. I do turn the white keep warm colors off. Basically, I want the most accurate colors possible in the natural profile. And if the camera goes back and warms them up a little bit, and again, this is for your JPEG files, I don't want to have to try to correct that later. So I just leave that off. Okay, and this is white balance for the flash. So it's automatically going to change the white balance based on what the flash is. Normally around 5500K. If you're really crazy about color being extremely accurate, these kind of settings will be more important to you. But for me, I can just be 90% there and then adjust it slightly in post. It's fine. But for something like product photography, and you're taking several different angles of the same item, you really, the color has to be extremely accurate, right? So a lot of these settings in this menu, you want to make sure you have right, and you want to be using, X-ray tools, etc. I mean, you can get really carried away, but for general shooting, I'm fine with just the auto. Let's see, did I miss anything here? Quick erase, I turn this on. So now what happens is when I go to hit the trash button to delete a picture, right? I'll show you. It just deletes it. It doesn't hit me up with a confirmation, yes or no. But as a practice, they say you shouldn't delete pictures in camera. You should delete them on your computer because there's some potential for corruption. I've never had a problem, but that one time it happens. It'll probably happen when I'm on a job, and it's going to really suck. But that's what that is. I just leave it on for quick erase. File name reset, edit file name. All of this is fine. Copyright settings, you can program your name and copyright name. I turn this on, so that way now my name will be embedded into the EXIF data of every file. Okay. And now we're in the iMovie menu. Okay. For movies, I do like to shoot in aperture priority. Microphone on, limiter on, wind noise reduction off. Because if you turn this on, it doesn't really help. Your best bet is to use an external microphone or put a dead cat somewhere on the microphones on the camera. All it does is mess up the audio. Time code settings. Actually, this is a little over my head. I sync everything up manually when I'm in post, but if you have multiple cameras, this might be a more important thing, but I don't touch anything there. Now in the movie mode, info settings, this is when you're in live view. I like to have everything shown when I'm in movie mode. So I know every setting that the camera has set in one glance. So I leave everything checked there. Specification settings. Just like the JPEG, the camera is not set to take the highest quality movies it can. The highest quality movie it can take is actually what they call all intra, so that it's in theory not doing any compression between frame to frame to frame. So if you're shooting at 30 frames or 30p, it's just capturing the image in full without trying to do any compression. Then superfine does a little bit of compression, fine does a little more, normal. So what I like to do, I found that all intra, the files are so big, I don't like to work with them, so I always shoot in superfine. But if I do decide I want to shoot in all intra, I'll put it to number 2, just in case. And you know, setting up the movie quality, the higher you go, the less pixelation you're going to get, particularly with fast-moving objects. Okay, now movie effect on. Basically, that's not affecting the movie while you're recording it. All it does is add a menu to the bottom. So I'll show you what that is. Okay. At the bottom here, these are your movie effects. So if I want the old film effect, or if I want blurring effects, you know, that's all that is. Okay. So you can play with those, but I like to leave that on. Movie photo mode 1, so it'll while it's recording the movie, you can take a picture, but it won't interrupt the movie. In mode 2, it'll record the movie, stop the movie, so you can take a picture, and then once you release the shutter, it'll start the movie again. But I'm very deliberate when I go out. I like to I like to either record movies or take pictures, not both at the same time. But the difference being in mode 1, the picture that it takes is going to be a JPEG in 16:9. If you do it in the other way, where it stops filming, takes the picture, it can take a raw picture, then start filming again. So that may be handy depending on what you're doing. So give that some thought when you go out shooting, but I just prefer mode 1. Okay. Now built-in EVF style. I just prefer this style, so I can see the whole frame of the picture without any numbers and letters over the top. But pick the one that you like. Info settings when you're in the EVF. Again, I like to turn these settings here. So now basically I have the basic information, and then if I want, I can see the histogram and the level gauge. In particular, it's the level gauge is what I use the most, because the histogram is so tiny on there, it's hard for me to see anyway, but I just leave it on. Display grid, I like to have that on, again to the same setting as the live view. EVF auto switch, me personally, I like to turn this off because it's so annoying that sometimes this EVF auto thing is a little too sensitive. So if I'm holding the camera like this and I get the screen tilted, it'll switch back to the EVF while I'm trying to actually compose something with the live view screen. So I turn this off so that I'm very deliberate about whether I want to use the EVF or the live view. Okay, and then EVF adjust, I turn this off. That way the brightness of the EVF is consistent. It doesn't change based on lighting conditions. I always want it to be the same. I guess in theory you might save a little battery life otherwise. But you know, whatever works for you, I like it off. And you can adjust the temperature and brightness of it here, but I just leave them at default. Okay, halfway level on. So all that is, you know, it'll display the level gauge if you have pressed the shutter versus having to toggle with the info button. I just leave that on. Okay, let me turn the info off. And finally, we're here at utility. Okay, utility is pixel mapping. I think you're supposed to do this, you know, once a month or once a year. You know, I just do it whenever I'm thinking about it. It doesn't hurt anything as far as I know. But what it's doing is it's looking for dead pixels in your sensor, and then it'll eliminate that dead pixel going forward, taking other pictures. So, you know, if you take a picture and you see a little white dot every time in the same place in all your pictures, you can run the pixel mapping program here, and it'll eliminate that white pixel in pictures going forward. So it hasn't happened to me yet, but I've seen it in one of my Nikon cameras, my older ones, and it didn't have this feature. So every time I go in the post, I had to like dot that little white dot out. But I don't know if it turns that dot to black, or, you know, merges or blends, you know, the surrounding pixels into that pixel, but that's what that's for. Okay, now exposure shift. If you want all your pictures to be plus or minus a certain amount of stops, you can set it to do that for all pictures. It's not something I use. I leave everything at default. Warning level, to me this is useless also because I'm using, you know, cheap Chinese batteries sometimes. Sometimes I'm using the factory batteries, and they're all different depending on age. This is, to me, is not reliable. If I see a red blinking light, I change the battery because we're close no matter what this is, +1 or +2. Okay, level adjust. If you want to change the way the level behaves, you know, let's say for whatever reason you want the camera at an angle like this to be considered level, you can set it to that, so that, you know, if you're moving this way, I can't think of any use that I would use it for, but maybe that'll work for you for something, I don't know. Touch settings I leave on. Okay, electronic zoom speed, everything is normal, but you can change that to high and low, but normal's fine. And quick sleep mode I always leave on, just to save battery life, and that's it. Okay, so that's all of the settings I use when I go out street shooting. Now that was a lot of stuff, so I don't want to lose any of that next time I turn the camera on, so I can save all of that to the My Set 1. So let's do that real quick. Let me just make sure I'm in the right. Put this back into Aperture Priority. Okay. Let's see. I need this to be in natural. And I always like to double check my settings in the Super Control panel. I do want this to be single point. All this looks good. The only other thing I would change, I believe, is in the display menu. Mode guide. I'm going to turn this off. Okay, and what that is, I'm going to leave it on just so I can show you. Mode guide is basically when you turn the dial, you'll see this little pop-up to tell me that I'm in shutter priority mode. But it's also right here anyway. So I don't need this little pop-up in between. So I just turn it off in the menu. Like that. Now when I change from aperture to shutter and back, it stays in, you know, it doesn't pop up. So I like to turn that off. So that's it. Okay, so let's go ahead and save everything to My Set 1. Where is that? Right here. Okay, so I click over to the right, set current shooting mode and settings, and I click set. So now I've just saved everything to My Set 1. And if you remember earlier, I set everything on My Set 1 to the mode dial called iAuto. So let's say I change everything here, and I'm shooting in monotone, and I'm only shooting raw, like this, and I'm in a custom shutter for some reason, etc. You know, I can change whatever I want here, but if I want to go back to all the settings, no matter how many settings I changed before, I just go into iAuto, and now everything is back to the way I had it and the way I want it. Excuse me. So that pretty much sums it up. That's how I set up my camera when I go out shooting. So think about all the settings I did and how you might change them or adapt them so that they work better for you. You know, now that you have this information, you know, go ahead and start working with your camera to make it a better camera for you. Now I programmed the other My Sets to do different things. I did in my previous video, I programmed My Set 2 to be my ultimate bracketing camera, HDR camera. And then I set My Set 3 to be my ultimate off-camera flash setting camera. So you can do infinite number of things with this. So go out and have some fun. And again, thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.